everybody! 大家好! I welcome you to Jade Palace Yamingo. My name is Yaya. Halloween inches closer and closer. Are you ready for the spooky season? Let's set the mood and pave the way for Halloween by reading some classic Chinese horror stories. So let's get started. Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, Liao Zhai, written by Pu Songling, is the most iconic Chinese historical literature that focuses on demons, spirits, ghosts, and immortals. Many modern horror media have taken influence from it. So turn off your lights, snuggle into a blanket, grab a hot beverage as I bring to you today Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, written by Pu Songling. An Otherworldly Examination. Song Tao was the grandfather of my elder sister's husband. He was a first-degree graduate and a holder of an annual government stipend. One day he was lying ill in bed when he saw a messenger arrive at his door, bearing an official-looking document and leading a horse with a white markings on its forehead. You are hereby summoned to the examination for the second degree. But the examiner has not arrived in this town yet. They cannot be holding an examination. The messenger made no reply, but urged him to be on his way. So Song struggled out of bed, climbed onto the horse, and was carried away down an unfamiliar road, which soon led to the outskirts of a city grand enough to be a royal capital. Presently, they passed through the imposing buildings of a prefect's yamen and into a large hall, where sitting up ahead, Song beheld a group of high-ranking mandarins, none of whom he could identify, with the exception of the god of war, Guan Yu. At the end of the hall, beneath the eaves, stood a pair of low tables and round stools, and at one of these sat another man, evidently a first-degree graduate like himself. Song sat down at the other table, and where brush and paper had been laid ready, and presently a strip of paper with a title of a formal essay topic came fluttering down from the blue and alighted in front of him. Song read the wording of the question: 1 man, 2 men, with intent, without intent. The two candidates proceeded to write their essays, and when they were completed, handed them at the dais. Song's essay read in part: Virtue pursued with intent deserves no reward. Evil committed without intent merits no punishment. The pantheon of examiners passed his script along, and all of them praised it highly. Presently, they called Song up to the dais and delivered the following judgment. There is a city god vacancy in the Henan province. You are the preferred candidate for the position. The truth suddenly dawned on Song. He kowtowed to the examiners, weeping and saying, How could I ever presume to decline such a great honor? But my aged mother is in her 70s, and will have no one left to look after her. I beg to be allowed to nurse her until the end of her allotted span of life, when I will gladly take up the post. One of the examiners, who appeared to be the presiding deity, gave orders to check the mother's longevity file, and an attendant with a long beard brought out the registers and began leafing through them. The lady in question has 9 years left on the young plane, he reported. The committee of deities was still debating the issue when the god of war made a proposal. Why do we not appoint the other candidate, Mr. Zhang, to the post in an acting capacity for a period of 9 years, after which time candidate Song can take up his plenary appointment? This being agreed upon, he informed Song of the committee's decision in the following terms. In the normal course of events, you should proceed straight to this post. In view, however, of your laudable feelings of benevolence and filial piety, We are approving a sabbatical leave of 9 years. When that time has expired, you will be summoned again before this board. He ended up giving the other candidates a few chosen words of advice, whereupon both men bowed and withdrew from the hall. Zhang took Song companionably by the hand and accompanied him to the outskirts of the town, where he explained that he was from the town of Changshan, and presented Song with a poem of farewell, the words of which have been lost save for a couplet. With wine and flowers, the spring is ever present. With neither candle nor lamp, the night is still bright. Song mounted his horse and went on his way. When he reached his village, he awoken as if from a dream, to discover that he had been lying dead for 3 whole days. His mother heard a groan emanating from within the coffin and immediately gave orders for her son's body to be lifted out of it. Half a day later, he had recovered sufficiently to be able to speak, and when he made inquiries in a nearby Changshan, he learned that a Mr. Zhang of the town had indeed breathed his last on the very same day as himself. 9 years later, Song's mother passed away, as had been foretold. When her funeral rites were concluded, her son performed his ablutions, retired to his chambers, lay down, and died. His wife's parents lived within the west gate of the town, and at the moment of his death, they saw him approaching their house. Escorted by a large retinue and riding a richly caparisoned horse, he came walking into their main hall, made them a formal bow of farewell, and went on his way. Not realizing that he was a departed spirit, they rushed out in great perplexity to inquire what it could mean, only to be informed that their son-in-law had just died. Song wrote a short account of his experience, but alas, after the great troubles, it was lost. I have given the gist of it. Living Dead. A certain old man of Yangxing came to live at Tai Village, a few miles from my hometown. Here he and his son opened a roadside tavern where travelers could put up for the night. It became a regular halt for many carters and itinerant merchants who plied their trade on that route. One evening, as dusk fell, 4 strangers arrived at the inn and asked for lodging, only to be told by the landlord that every bed was taken. They protested that it was too late for them to journey on, and pleaded with him to take them in. Finally, after much pondering and hesitation, he said that he could perhaps offer them a place for the night, but that he feared it would not meet with their liking. They replied that any lodging, even a mat in an outhouse, would suit them well. They were in no position to be choosy. It so happened that the old man's daughter-in-law had only recently died, and her body was lying in one of the rooms of the inn. His son had gone away to buy the wood for the coffin, and had not yet returned. The landlord led the travelers to this room, which was slightly apart from the main compound. On the other side of the thoroughfare, it had been chosen as a lying-in room for its relative seclusion. When they entered, they saw a lamp burning on a small table, beyond which curtains were draped across the room. Through the curtains, they caught a glimpse of the corpse itself, stretched out on a trestle bed and covered with a paper shroud. In an alcove to one side of the room, the men saw a row of 4 beds, and exhausted from their day's journey, they threw themselves down and were soon snoring loudly, with the exception of one, and even he was finally beginning to doze off when he heard a creaking sound coming from the trestle bed, on which the dead body was laid out. Opening his eyes, he was able by the light of the lamp to distinguish the figure of the girl as she lifted off her paper shroud, got down from the bed, and starting to move towards the alcove where he and the other 3 were sleeping. Her face gave off a golden glow, and she had a turban of raw silk wrapped around her forehead. When she reached the beds, she blew on each of the 3 sleeping men in turn, and the fourth man, terrified that she would come to him next, stealthily drew the bedclothes up over his face and lay there holding his breath and listening. He heard her breathe on him just as she had done on the others. And then he heard the sound of her footsteps as she walked back from the alcove, and the rustling of the paper shroud as she climbed back on to her trestle bed. Poking out his head, he saw her lying there, a rigid corpse once more. He did not dare to make a sound, but stretched out a foot and furtively kicked his companions, not one of whom made the slightest movement in response. His only hope of survival, he now decided, lay in getting dressed and making a dash for it. He rose up in his bed and was about to put on his clothes when he heard the creaking sounds again and dived back in terror under the covers. Once more the girl walked over to the alcove, and once more she breathed on him through the covers, this time several times. Before returning to her bed, he heard the trestles creak and knew she must be lying down again. This time he reached slowly for his trousers, hardly stirring from his bed, then slipped quickly into them and ran barefoot towards the door. The next instant, the corpse rose from its bed and set off in hot pursuit after him. He had already unbolted the door and was gone, but she chased him through the village. All the while he ran ahead of her, screaming. Not a single villager seemed to hear, and he did not dare to stop and rouse the landlord by knocking at the inn door, for fear that the slightest delay might result in his capture by the fiend. Instead, he kept running as fast as his legs could carry him, out of the village and in the direction of the county town. As he came to the eastern outskirts of the town, he caught sight of a Buddhist temple and heard the thunk, thunk of the wooden fish that the monks were beating during their prayers. He ran up and knocked urgently at the temple gate, but the monks were too frightened to let in an unknown stranger in the middle of the night and turned him away. When he looked behind him, he saw the living corpse bearing down upon him. He had not a second to lose. Before the temple stood a poplar tree, some 4 or 5 feet in circumference. He darted behind it, dodging this way and that, always keeping the trunk between himself and the corpse, who now seemed to be growing increasingly fierce. They were both becoming more and more exhausted when all of a sudden the corpse stood stock still. On his side of the tree trunk, the man was perspiring heavily from his exertions and quite out of breath. Suddenly, he too froze, and the corpse lunged violently forward, reaching out both arms in a desperate and unsuccessful attempt to clutch at him around the tree. In utter terror, the man collapsed on the ground. The corpse remained there fixed in place, rigidly embracing the tree. The monks had been following all of this from the safety of the temple precincts, and when the sound of the struggle died away, they came creeping out to find the man lying on the ground. They shone a light of lamp on him, and though at first he seemed dead, when they felt his heart, they detected the faintest trace of a pulse. They carried him inside, and late that night, when he finally regained consciousness, they gave him some broth to drink and told him the whole story. When the martin bell rang, they went out into the misty light to examine the tree, and found the girl's corpse still tightly clamped to it. In great consternation, they reported the strange event to the county magistrate, who came in person to investigate and conduct an inquest. He ordered his men to pull the girl's hands away from the tree, but this proved almost impossible, and on closer inspection, they could see that her fingers, which were curled like hooks, had penetrated into the trunk of the tree, burying her nails deep in the wood. It took the concerted efforts of several men to prise her away. The finger holes were long and narrow, as if they were bored by a carpenter's awl. A messenger was sent to inform the old landlord, whose inn was in a great state of commotion, both at the disappearance of the corpse and at the discovery of the 3 travelers dead in their beds. The old man followed the messenger back and gave instructions for the dead body of his daughter-in-law to be transported back to the inn on a stretcher. The surviving traveler tearfully confided to the magistrate the difficulty of his situation. The four of us left home together, and when I returned to my village on my own, no one is going to believe my story. The magistrate provided him with a written certification of the facts and an allowance for his journey home. The Painted Skin. A certain gentleman by the name of Wang from the city of Taiyuan was out walking early one morning when a young woman passed him carrying a bundle. Hurrying along on her own, though with considerable difficulty, he caught up with her and saw that at once she was a girl of about 16 and very beautiful. "What are you doing out here all alone at this early hour?" he asked, instantly smitten. "Why do you bother to ask, since you are only a passerby and can do nothing to ease my troubles?" was her reply. "Tell me, what has caused this sorrow of yours? I would do anything I can to help you." "My parents were greedy for money," she replied sadly, "and sold me as a concubine to a rich man's household. The master's wife was jealous of me, and she was always screaming at me and beating me until in the end I could bear it no longer and decided to run away." "Where are you going?" "I am a fugitive. I have no place to go." "My own humble abode is not far from here," said Wang. "I should be honored if you were to accompany me there." She seemed only too pleased at the suggestion and followed him home, Wang carrying her bundle for her. When they arrived, she observed that the house was not empty. "Do you have no family of your own?" she asked. "This is my private study," he replied. "This seems like an excellent place for me," she said. "But I must ask you to keep my presence here a secret, and not to breathe a word of it to anyone. My very life depends on it." He swore to this. That night they slept together, and for several days he kept her hidden away in his study, without anyone knowing that she was there. Then he decided to confide in his wife, the Lady Chen. She feared the consequences if the girl should turn out to have escaped from some influential family, and advised him to send her away. But he paid no heed to her advice. A few days later in the marketplace, Wang ran into a Taoist priest, who studied his face with grave concern. "What strange thing have you encountered?" "Why, nothing," replied Wang. "Nothing? Your whole being is wrapped in an evil aura," insisted the Taoist. "I tell you, you are bewitched." Wang protests vehemently that he was speaking the truth. "Bewitched," muttered the Taoist as he went on his way. "Poor fool! Some men blind themselves to the truth, even when death is staring them in the face." Something in the Taoist's strange words set Wang wondering, and he began to have serious misgivings about the young woman he had taken in. But he could not bring himself to believe that such a pretty young thing could have cast an evil spell on him. Instead, he persuaded himself that the Taoist was making it all up, trying to put the wind up in him in hope of being retained for a costly rite of exorcism. And so he put the matter out of his mind and returned home. He reached his study to find the outer door barred. He was unable to enter his own home. His suspicions now generally aroused, he clambered into the courtyard and through a hole in the wall, only to find that the inner door was also closed. Creeping stealthily up to a window, he peeped through and saw the most hideous sight: a green-faced monster, a ghoul with great jagged teeth like a saw, leaning over a human pelt, the skin of an entire human body spread on the bed, on his bed. The monster had a paintbrush in its hand and was in the process of touching up the skin in lifelike colors. When the painting was done, it threw down the brush, lifted up the skin, shook it out like a cloak, and wrapped itself in it, whereupon it was instantly transformed into his pretty young fugitive friend. Wang was absolutely terrified by what he had seen and crept away on all fours. He went at once in search of the Taoist, but did not know where to find him. He looked for him everywhere and eventually found him out in the fields. Falling on his knees, he begged the priest to save him. "I can drive her away for you," said the Taoist, "but I cannot bring myself to take her life. The poor creature must have suffered greatly, and is clearly close to finding a substitute and thus ending her torment." He gave Wang a fly whisk and told him to hang it outside his bedroom door, instructing him to come and find him again in the temple of the Green Emperor. Wang returned home. This time he did not dare to go into his study, but slept with his wife, hanging the fly whisk outside their bedroom. Late that night he heard a faint sound at the door, and not having the courage to look himself, he asked his wife to go. It was the girl. She had come, but had halted on seeing the fly whisk and was standing there grinding her teeth. Eventually she went away, only to return after a little while. "That priest thought to scare me," she cried. "I'll never give up. Not now. Not when I am so close. Does he think I am going to spit it out when I am so near to swallowing it?" She tore down the fly whisk and ripped it into pieces, then broke down the door and burst into the bedroom. Climbing straight up onto the bed, she tore open Wang's chest, plucked out his heart, and made off with it into the night. Wang's wife began screaming, and a maid came hurrying in with a lamp to find her master lying dead on the bed, his chest a bloody pulp, and her mistress sobbing in silent horror beside him, incapable of uttering a word. The next morning they sent Wang's younger brother off at once to find the Taoist. "To think that I took pity on her!" cried the priest angrily. "Clearly that fiend will stop at nothing." He followed Wang's brother back to the house. By now, of course, there were no trace of the girl. The Taoist gazed around him. "Fortunately, she is still close at hand." He went on to ask, "Who lives in the house to the south?" "That is my family's compound," replied Wang's brother. "That is where she is now," said the priest. Wang's brother was appalled at the idea and could not bring himself to believe it. "Has a stranger come to your house today?" asked the priest. "How would I know?" replied the brother. "I went out first thing to the temple of the Green Emperor to fetch you. I shall have to go home and ask." Presently he returned to report that there had indeed been an old lady. "She called first thing this morning, saying she wanted to work for us. My wife kept her on and she is still there." "That is the person we are looking for," cried the Taoist. He strode next door immediately with the brother and took up a stance in middle of the courtyard, brandishing his wooden sword. "Come out, evil one!" he cried. "Give me back my fly whisk." The old woman came hurtling out of the building, her face deathly pale, and made a frantic attempt to escape. But the Taoist pursued her and struck her down. As she fell to the ground, the human pelt slipped from her, to reveal her as the vile fiend she really was, groveling on the ground and grunting like a pig. The Taoist swung his wooden sword again and chopped off the monster's head, whereupon its body was transformed into a thick cloud of smoke hovering above the ground. The Taoist now took out a bottle gourd, removed the stopper, and placed it in the midst of the smoke. With a whooshing sound, the smoke was sucked into the gourd, leaving no trace in the courtyard. He replaced the stopper and slipped the gourd back into his bag. When they examined the pelt, it was complete in every human detail: the eyes, the hands, and feet. The Taoist proceeded to roll it up like a scroll. It even made the same sound, placed it in his bag, and set off. Wang's wife, who was waiting for him at the entrance, beseeched him to bring her husband back to life. And when the Taoist protested that he had already reached the limits of his power, she became more and more hysterical and inconsolable, throwing herself to the ground and absolutely refusing to get up. The Taoist seemed to ponder the matter deeply. Truly, I cannot raise the dead, he said eventually, but I can tell you of one who may be able to do so. Go to him and ask him, and dare I say, he will be able to help you. Wang's wife asked him who he was referring to. He is a madman who frequents the marketplace and sleeps on a dunghill. You must go down on your knees and beg him to help you. If he insults you, madam, you must on no account go against him or be angry with him. Wang's brother knew of this beggar. He took his leave of the Taoist and accompanied his sister-in-law to the marketplace, where they found the man begging by the roadside, singing a crazy song. A good 3 inches of mucus trailed from his nose, and he was so foul it was unthinkable to go near him. But Wang's wife approached him on her knees. "Do you love me, my pretty?" leered the mad beggar. She told him her tale, and he laughed loudly. "There's plenty of fine men in this world for you to marry. Why bother bringing him back to life?" She pleaded with him. "You're a strange one," he said. "You want me to raise the dead? Who do you take me for? The king of hell?" He struck her with his stick, and she bore it without a murmur. By now a crowd had gathered around them. The beggar spat a great glob of phlegm into the palm of his hand and held it up to her mouth. "Eat!" She flushed deeply and could not bring herself to obey his order. Then she remembered what the Taoist had commanded and steeled herself to swallow the congealed phlegm. As it went down her throat, it felt hard like a lump of cotton wadding, and even when, after several gulps, she managed to swallow it down, she could still feel it lodged in her chest. The madman guffawed. "You really do love me then, don't you, my darling?" And with those words he went off. The meeting was clearly over, and he paid her no further attention. She followed him into the temple, determined to plead with him again. But though she searched every corner of the temple, she could find no trace of him. So she returned home greatly downcast. Filled with grief at her husband's appalling death, and overcome with shame and self-disgust at the treatment she had tolerated from the mad beggar, she wailed pathetically and for a time contemplated taking her own life. When eventually she went to wash the blood from her husband's corpse and prepared for the coffin, her women stood to one side watching, none of them having the stomach to approach their dead master's corpse. She lifted him up in her arms and started carefully replacing his internal organs, sobbing so fiercely that she began to choke and feel nauseous. Then she felt the lump of phlegm rising in her gullet and brought it up, so suddenly that she had no time to turn away, but spat it directly into the gaping wound in her husband's chest. She stared aghast. The phlegm had become a human heart, and lay there throbbing, hot and steaming. In disbelief, she brought the sides of the wound together with both her hands, pressing with all her strength. If she relaxed her grip for an instant, she saw hot steam leaking from the wound. She tore a strip of silk from her dress and bound the wound tightly. In a little while, when she touched her husband's corpse, she felt the warmth returning. She drew the bed covers fully over it. In the middle of the night, when she lifted the covers, he was already breathing through his nose. By the next morning, he was fully alive. "I was drifting," he said. "Everything was confused. It was like a dream. But all the time, I felt this deep pain in my heart." The wound formed a scar the size of a coin, which disappeared with time. Not wanting to spoil you guys completely, I will leave you to read The Magic Sword and the Magic Bag on your own. This is perhaps the most popular and famous of Pu Songling's work. This is the story of Nie Xiaoqian, which has been adapted countlessly into films and dramas. These are but a few of the many stories in the book, and if these have caught your attention, please explore the text when you can. But in the meantime, I wish you a safe and spooky Happy Halloween. I have a Teespring if you'd like to support the channel. I have a lot of super cute designs that I'm really proud of, so please check it out if you can. Link is in the description below. So what do you guys think? Which was your favorite story? Leave a comment down below because I would like to know. Also, please leave a comment if you can. It really does help out small channels like mine. You can also let me know what topics you'd like to see me cover in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to Jade Palace Yamingong. I would very much appreciate it. And until next time, happy Halloween! 再见啦，拜拜。